Born on February 22nd, 1824, Pierre Janssen was a French astronomer who lived through the turn of the century before he passed in December of 1907. Hi, I'm Chris May, writer, producer, and host of This Day in Weather History, a podcast from the Weather Network in Canada, and sponsored by Tourism Ireland. Ireland is ready whenever you are. Plan your trip today. Press the green button now. Pierre-Jules César Janssen is the co-discoverer of this much less dense gas known as helium. But he discovered the concept of helium through his observations of solar eclipses. This day in weather history. You got to admit, the best thing about any party with helium-filled balloons is when one rowdy participant opens one up and inhales the gas. That's when everyone laughs themselves silly while someone is talking to everyone like Alvin and the Chipmunks. But it's his December 22nd, 1870 solar eclipse expedition that brings him into the discussion. It was on a Thursday, this December 22nd, when Janssen's story opened like a Hollywood thriller. France was in the grips of the Franco-Prussian War, and our hero made a harrowing escape from a German siege of Paris. But in 1870, how do you get away that fast? Aha, you take to the air. And he did, by flying in a hot air balloon to Algeria in an attempt to study a solar eclipse. He was like, so long as I'm up here running for my life, I may as well multitask. Janssen flew to Oran, Algeria, to study what he had expected to be an eclipse, but by the time he arrived, the clouds completely obscured visibility. It happens, but when you have no idea if you will ever get this chance again, it must have been soul-crushing. Weather gets in the way of the big picture again. But he did get more opportunities at these observations and notations that would go on to educate generations to come. You're listening to This Day in Weather History, now in its second year from the Weather Network. This month is sponsored by Tourism Ireland, where the world's longest coastal touring route is waiting for you. It's time to press the green button. Plan your trip to Ireland today. He was in Italy for a solar eclipse in 1867, in India in 1868, and then again in 1870. Then in 1875, he experienced another eclipse in Thailand, which back then was called Siam. And then he saw one in the Caroline Islands in 1883, before his passing at the end of 1907. And as an old man who had never lost his appetite for this science, he saw one last eclipse in 1905 in Spain. It was during his 1868 solar eclipse trip up into the air while in British India, where he noticed there were strange bright lines in the spectrum of the chromosphere. He immediately recognized that as evidence that the chromosphere is gaseous. The chromosphere is the second most outer layer of the sun, so from here, he brought his discovery notes to English astronomer Joseph Norden Lockyer. Lockyer then recognized it as a new element, and it was named helium, from the Greek word helios, meaning sun. So, although if you look through them, in many textbooks and journals, Janssen appears in history as the person who discovered the gaseous nature of the solar chromosphere. But as we learned here on this podcast, he's pretty much the co-discoverer of helium as well. But as far as I'm concerned, and believe me, I think all of this is great, but I'd like to do a whole new podcast on how this guy escaped the Germans in a war. It's madness. Next up, the Zeppelin. Hey, maybe another podcast for another time. And he did so by literally the only means possible at the time for humans to take to the air, the helium-filled balloon. This day in weather history. Hey, do you like the podcast? We'd love to hear from you. If you have an idea, go right now to wherever you're listening to me and rate us if you would, please. It's on a 5-star system, and we would love as many stars as you can afford. So rate us, but then also review us. This way we can always stay on top of how you'd like to see the show evolve. Then remember to subscribe to this podcast. Click the subscribe or follow button right there on the very same podcast homepage you're listening on. You'll be immediately reminded that the next day is ready to listen to, and you also have access to every episode in the archives. It dates back to June 1st of 2020, so there is a lot that we got to get caught up on this day in weather history. Tomorrow, we are sitting in and dialing back the TDIWH time machine all the way back to 1775 and the scene of the Revolutionary War. We've been here before. Tomorrow, right here on This Day in Weather History, with me, your host, Chris May. and proudly sponsored by Tourism Ireland. Ireland is open and ready to welcome you. Press the green button now to experience epic, open landscapes.